The winter of 1939 settled heavily over Pittsburgh, laying a gray shroud across the valleys of iron and smoke. Snow fell, but it never stayed white for long. It turned black as soot the moment it touched the ground. The furnaces of the Monongahela Valley were alive, roaring like dragons in their stone lairs, and the night sky glowed orange from the reflection of molten metal pouring through open channels. To anyone watching from a hillside, it might have looked like the gates of hell itself had opened. But inside those mills, amidst the sweat, fire, and noise, men were giving birth to something greater than they understood. The world beyond the Atlantic was already burning. Hitler's panzers had rolled through Poland, and the Luftwaffe had turned Warsaw into rubble. Across Europe, nations fell like dominoes before the relentless march of mechanized war. France trembled, Britain fought alone, and America, still licking the wounds of the Great Depression, watched uneasily from across the sea. Officially, the United States stood neutral. Unofficially, something vast and unstoppable was stirring in its heartland. Steel. It began as whispers in the factories, rumors that the government had begun issuing new contracts, that the Navy wanted more armor plating, that rail shipments of iron ore had tripled. The mill workers didn't ask questions. They didn't need to. Their job was simple: feed the furnaces, keep the metal flowing. And they did, day after day, night after night, as the blast furnaces belched fire into the frozen air. Among them was a man named Charles Hardwick, a metallurgist in his early 40s, with hands like iron and eyes that carried the light of the molten steel he studied. He wasn't a soldier or a politician. He was a scientist of heat and force, a man who understood that the future of war would be decided not only by who fired first, but by whose armor held last. For years he had studied the molecular dance of metals, testing new alloys in the labs of the U.S. Steel Research Division. Most of his experiments ended in failure: plates that shattered under stress, steel too brittle to bend, or too soft to withstand impact. But in late 1940, as Hitler's armies occupied Paris and the skies over London turned to flame, Hardwick found something extraordinary. By combining precise ratios of nickel, molybdenum, and vanadium, and subjecting the alloy to a new heat treatment process that alternated rapid quenching with controlled reheating, he created a steel plate that could absorb tremendous kinetic energy without fracturing. When he tested it, the impact shell barely left a dent. It flexed instead of cracked. It was armor that behaved like bone. Hardwick ran the test again. Then again, same result. His discovery would later become known as rolled homogeneous armor, RHA, the material that would protect the hulls of the M4 Sherman and countless other machines of war. At the time, however, it was simply another sample logged into the U.S. Steel Archive. Hardwick didn't know it yet, but he had just laid the foundation for America's greatest wartime advantage. Meanwhile, across the country, the government was beginning to realize what was coming. Franklin D. Roosevelt, ever the strategist, looked beyond the headlines. He saw what Hitler was building: a war machine fueled by slave labor and ruthless efficiency. He understood that America's safety depended not only on geography, but on production. If Europe fell, the United States would need to become the world's factory, its arsenal, its last defense. In the spring of 1940, Roosevelt delivered a speech that echoed through every mill and yard. "We must be the great arsenal of democracy." The phrase struck like a spark in dry tinder. Within months, idle factories were retooled and new contracts flowed into the heartland. Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler, once makers of cars, were ordered to prepare for tanks, planes, and engines. Bethlehem Steel expanded its operations along the Delaware River, constructing massive plate mills capable of turning out ship armor in record time. The transformation was staggering. In towns like Gary, Indiana, and Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, workers poured into the mills by the thousands. Trains carrying iron ore thundered down from Minnesota's Mojave Range. Coal from Appalachia fed the furnaces. Limestone from Ohio tempered the slag. America's geology itself seemed to rise in defiance, offering its minerals to the cause of freedom. The work was brutal. Temperatures inside the blast houses soared above 120 degrees. Men worked shirtless even in winter, their skin glistening with sweat and grime. The roar of machinery was deafening. Giant rollers pressed red-hot slabs of steel into plates as thick as a man's arm. Sparks flew in showers like shooting stars. The smell of oil, smoke, and ozone filled the air. Accidents were common. Burns, crushed limbs, even deaths were accepted as part of the job. Yet the workers rarely complained. "We're not just making steel," one mill hand said, wiping soot from his face. "We're making armor for our boys, even if they ain't fighting yet." By late 1940, America's production had reached levels no nation had ever achieved. The numbers were staggering. Tens of millions of tons of steel rolling out annually, enough to build entire fleets. And still, the furnaces demanded more. Every ton of steel meant another ship's hull, another gun barrel, another tank. It was a race against time, and the workers knew it. When the Luftwaffe began its bombardment of Britain, American steel was already flowing across the Atlantic in convoys, destined for British shipyards. The plates stamped Bethlehem Steel Co., USA, were welded onto destroyers that would patrol the Atlantic and keep the supply lines open. Across the ocean, British sailors ran their hands across the smooth, dark gray armor and whispered a kind of reverence. They could feel the difference. It was harder, denser, somehow more alive. By the fall of 1941, the lines between peace and war had blurred completely. The Lend-Lease Act turned American factories into lifelines for Allied nations. Everywhere, production soared beyond imagination. Entire towns sprang up around the mills to house workers. Women joined the lines, their hair tied back under scarves, learning to weld, rivet, and run the cranes. The myth that industry belonged to men alone vanished in the firelight of the furnaces. But it wasn't just manpower, it was mind power. Engineers, chemists, and physicists poured into research labs, experimenting with alloys, tensile strengths, and fatigue resistance. Universities collaborated with industry. Scientists who once studied peacetime metallurgy now worked day and night on ballistic steel. It was the age of invention, and every discovery, no matter how small, mattered. When news of Pearl Harbor reached the steel towns, the air changed. The radio broadcasts echoed through break rooms and cafeteria halls. Workers dropped their tools and listened in stunned silence. America was at war. But there was no fear, only fury, only resolve. Men who had spent years behind the furnaces lined up at recruitment offices, while those too old to fight went back to work with redoubled purpose. The mills ran 24 hours a day, their flames painting the sky red, white, and defiant. One reporter visiting the U.S. steel plant in Homestead wrote, "If you stand on the riverbank at night and look toward the mills, you'll see America's heart beating in fire. It's the glow of freedom being born." In that fire, under the deafening clang of hammers and the hiss of molten metal, the foundation of victory was forged. For while Hitler's scientists dreamed of rockets and wonder weapons, America built something simpler and far stronger, the industrial miracle that no dictatorship could replicate. It wasn't just the steel itself, it was what that steel represented, the unyielding will of a free people, the ingenuity of countless minds, the unity of labor and purpose. By the time 1941 drew to a close, the world was changing course. The furnaces of Pittsburgh, Gary, Bethlehem, and Birmingham no longer belonged to industry alone. They belonged to destiny. The war machine of democracy had awakened, and its heartbeat was measured not in gunfire, but in the thunder of rolling mills and the hiss of molten steel. And as the first fully American-built tanks rolled off the lines, gleaming under factory lights, a quiet truth settled over the nation. Hitler could command armies, conquer nations, enslave millions, but he could never forge this. This fire, this unity, this steel was something born of freedom itself. The dawn of 1942 did not come quietly. It rose over a nation that had traded sleep for steel, comfort for conviction. The attack on Pearl Harbor had seared away any illusions of distance or safety. America, once a reluctant spectator, was now a nation transformed. Its factories, shipyards, and foundries beating in furious rhythm to a single, united purpose: war. Everywhere, the signs of change were visible. In Detroit, the hum of the automobile industry had turned into the roar of war machines. The great car plants, the pride of the American dream, were now temples of destruction, sanctified by necessity. Henry Ford, who had once revolutionized the world with the Model T, now looked upon his greatest challenge, building a bomber factory capable of outproducing nations. He called it Willow Run. Willow Run was not a factory, it was a continent under a roof. A mile long, wide enough to house entire neighborhoods, it sprawled across the Michigan plains like an iron leviathan. Engineers said it was impossible to mass-produce aircraft. Ford simply told them to move faster. If we can make a car in 90 minutes, he said, we can make a bomber in a day. And so he did. Within a year, the Willow Run plant produced a B-24 Liberator bomber every 55 minutes. It was industrial sorcery, fueled by the fire of American ingenuity. Each B-24 that rolled out of Willow Run was a flying fortress of American metal, its skeleton forged from the very steel that poured out of Pennsylvania's glowing rivers. When the wings caught sunlight on the tarmac, they gleamed like mirrors of destiny. Workers would pause to watch them lift into the sky, knowing that somewhere over Europe, those wings would carry vengeance and freedom. But the miracle wasn't just in Detroit. Across the nation, an army of workers, 12 million strong, rose before dawn and marched not with rifles, but with hammers, torches, and rivet guns. They were factory soldiers, their uniforms denim and grease, their battlefield the assembly line. In Richmond and Portland, the Kaiser shipyards grew overnight into sprawling complexes of cranes and sparks. Henry J. Kaiser, a man who had never built a ship before, promised the government he could do what no navy had ever done: build a cargo ship faster than the enemy could sink it. They called them Liberty ships, unassuming, steel-bellied freighters meant to carry supplies, tanks, and troops across the U-boat-infested Atlantic. The first took months to build. The last were built in days. In one record-shattering feat, Kaiser's workers launched the Robert E. Peary just 4 days and 15 hours after her keel was laid. Hitler's admirals couldn't believe the reports. German U-boat captains spoke of sinking ships one week, only to see replacements sailing the next. It was as if the Atlantic itself were birthing vessels made of American willpower. In those shipyards, the workforce was unlike anything the world had seen. Men and women labored side by side. Welders, machinists, and fitters shared tools and determination. Women with kerchiefs wrapped tight against the sparks became icons of resilience. Rosie the Riveter was no propaganda fantasy. She was real, countless times over. Their hands, calloused and strong, held the same courage as the soldiers who would storm beaches thousands of miles away. The air above America shimmered with the light of industry. Smokestacks reached for the sky like steel cathedrals, their clouds rolling into the heavens. At night, the glow from the mills painted the horizon red, and travelers by train swore they could see the reflection from 100 miles away. The noise was endless. The thundering press of hydraulic machines, the hammering of rivets, the whistle of molten metal poured into molds. It was a song of power, a hymn of democracy sung in fire and iron. President Roosevelt watched it all unfold with a quiet pride. He had gambled everything on the faith that a free people could outbuild tyranny. His arsenal of democracy was no longer a slogan. It was a living, breathing reality. By mid-1942, American factories produced more steel than Germany, Japan, and Italy combined. The same furnaces that had once churned out farm tools and car frames now birthed destroyers, battleships, tanks, and bombers. In the small towns that fed the industrial giants, life changed forever. The grocers, barbers, and teachers became welders and inspectors. Children collected scrap metal, tossing pots, pans, and broken bicycles into government bins marked for victory. Women learned to operate lathes and presses. Men who had been unemployed during the Depression now earned union wages. Across the country, trains screamed with the weight of new shipments, iron ore, coal, rubber, and oil, all flowing toward a single purpose. In Pennsylvania, the furnaces of Bethlehem Steel reached full fury. Entire rivers of molten iron streamed into molds, cooled, and emerged as the hull plates for destroyers and aircraft carriers. The plant ran so hot that residents of nearby towns said their windows rattled from the blast pressure. In 1 month alone, Bethlehem Steel produced enough metal to build an entire fleet. The steel workers joked that they could tell where their work was headed just by the sound of the hammering. If it sings high, it's ship armor. If it thuds low, it's tank plate. Meanwhile, American metallurgists refined their craft to perfection. They experimented tirelessly, creating stronger, lighter alloys that would change the physics of war. A new class of heat-treated armor emerged, able to withstand direct hits from German 88mm shells. Jet engine prototypes demanded metals that could survive unimaginable temperatures. Engineers delivered with chromium-molybdenum steels that turned blue in the heat but never failed. German intelligence officers collected fragments of downed American planes and tanks, sending them to laboratories in Essen for analysis. The reports returned in disbelief. The notes read, "Composition inconsistent with known alloys. Production method unknown." What Hitler's scientists couldn't grasp was that America's secret wasn't locked in chemistry, it was in collaboration. Universities, private companies, and government laboratories shared research openly, racing together toward solutions. There were no secret decrees, no executions for failure, no fear of innovation. A machinist in Ohio could send a suggestion to Washington, and it might change how the entire military built engines within weeks. Freedom itself was the alchemy the Axis could never replicate. By the summer of 1942, American steel was everywhere. In the Pacific, where aircraft carriers like the USS Enterprise stood unbroken amid waves of Japanese attacks. In the deserts of North Africa, where Sherman tanks rolled forward through sandstorms. In the skies over Europe, where B-17s returned home with holes punched through their wings, yet still flying, still alive. A bomber crewman once said after a mission, "When the bullets hit, it's like the plane winces, but it doesn't die. She's got American steel in her bones." And so she did. The power of that steel and the relentless will behind it changed the arithmetic of war. The Germans measured victory by precision. The Americans measured it by abundance. For every tank the Wehrmacht produced, the U.S. built 10. For every U-boat prowling the Atlantic, American shipyards launched a dozen cargo vessels. Where Hitler's regime controlled by terror, America united through purpose. It was a contest between fear and freedom was winning. In cities across the country, the war effort was everywhere. Posters adorned factory walls. "He's counting on you. Don't let him down." Churches prayed for the workers as much as the soldiers. At night, the sky glowed from the light of furnaces, and people whispered that even the stars seemed dimmer against the blaze of production. By the end of 1942, the numbers told the truth the enemy refused to believe. 48,000 aircraft, 60,000 tanks, 8 million tons of shipping, and more steel than any empire had ever produced. America had become not just a nation at war, it had become the machine of liberty itself. And behind every bomber that soared, every ship that sailed, every tank that rolled forward, there was a story that began in a mill, in the hands of workers who never saw the battlefield but who fought just as fiercely. They fought with fire. They fought with iron. They fought with will. And they forged the arsenal that tyranny could never match, the living miracle of American industry. The forges never slept. By the spring of 1943, America's factories had become living organisms, vast mechanical beasts that breathed smoke and roared thunder. From the heart of Pittsburgh to the docks of Seattle, from the shipyards of Mobile to the tank lines of Detroit, the land trembled under the relentless march of production. The sun rose not on a nation of farmers and dreamers, but on a new breed of soldier, the worker. Every morning, men and women flooded the gates, faces streaked with soot, lunch pails in hand, hearts steeled with purpose. The war was not somewhere far away anymore. It was in every rivet, every weld, every sheet of glowing steel that slid out of the mills. Rosie the Riveter wasn't a slogan, it was a heartbeat. Women swung hammers beside veterans of the Great Depression, their sleeves rolled high, their hair tied up, their eyes unflinching. America had discovered that courage could wear overalls as easily as a uniform. Inside the Ford River Rouge plant, the transformation was biblical. Where once Model Ts had rolled down the line, now came the wings of bombers, the B-24 Liberator, that strange metallic bird of war. It was said that every 55 minutes a new bomber emerged from the womb of American industry, gleaming, furious, and ready for battle. The workers would cheer as it took its first breath of jet fuel and rolled out into the dawn. A new weapon for freedom, born from sweat and steel. In Buffalo, Bethlehem Steel glowed red against the night, a volcano of fire feeding the Allied cause. The company had once built skyscrapers, symbols of ambition and pride. Now it built Liberty ships by the hundreds, each one a vessel of hope crossing treacherous seas. Hitler's U-boats lurked beneath the waves, hungry and tireless, but even they could not devour them all. The output was staggering. For every ship the Reich sank, America built 3 more. What Hitler didn't understand was that the miracle wasn't just the machines, it was the people. He thought war was won by iron and oil. But America had something Germany couldn't replicate: spirit. When a machine broke down, an engineer didn't wait for orders, he fixed it. When a part was missing, someone found a way to make it by hand. When the materials ran low, scientists created substitutes that worked better than the original. Necessity wasn't a burden, it was a muse. The Germans marveled at American ingenuity with equal parts envy and fear. Reports sent to Berlin described factories that seemed impossible, assembly lines that turned out planes faster than the Luftwaffe could shoot them down. The Americans are not fighting with men, one officer grumbled. They are fighting with machines that make machines. Even Hitler himself, in one of his rants, slammed his fist on the table and shouted that no one nation should be allowed such power. He didn't realize that it wasn't given, it was earned. In the Midwest, a new generation of metallurgists was rewriting the very laws of steel. At the Carnegie Institute, Dr. Harold Johnson stood over a crucible glowing white-hot, experimenting with trace elements: vanadium, molybdenum, nickel. They were crafting alloys that could withstand temperatures and pressures the Germans couldn't dream of matching. This wasn't just about quantity anymore, it was about mastery. The Luftwaffe's engines burned out under strain. Their armor cracked under impact. while American tanks and planes kept going, enduring, surviving. And still, the workers pushed on. The hours were long, the pay modest, the risks real. Accidents were common. Fires erupted, cranes collapsed, molten steel spilled like rivers of lava. Yet production never stopped. When one worker fell, another stepped forward. "We're building freedom," an old machinist said after pulling a friend from a collapsed beam. "That's worth a few scars." He wiped the sweat and soot from his face and went back to work. By the summer of '43, Allied generals were beginning to grasp the true scale of the transformation. Eisenhower, inspecting a convoy of Sherman tanks in England, remarked that these machines don't just roll, they multiply. He wasn't wrong. American production had become exponential. Aircraft, ships, tanks, trucks, bullets, millions upon millions of them, born from the same endless fire. In the Pacific, the Navy felt the change first. Once on the defensive, it now struck back with unrelenting force. New carriers slid off the slips weekly. Destroyers and submarines followed in their wake. Each hull bore the stamp of a factory thousands of miles away. Each rivet a story of an ordinary man or woman who refused to be ordinary. The enemy had awakened a sleeping giant, and now it was not merely awake, but unstoppable. At the same time, propaganda was no longer needed. The people didn't need reminding of why they worked. They could feel it. The radio broadcasts carried the thunder of war, and with every victory, every island reclaimed, the hammer of production fell harder. Children collected scrap metal. Farmers donated old plows. Mothers melted down pots for the cause. It was a symphony of sacrifice conducted in steel and fire. By late autumn, the industrial might of America had become a myth whispered even among German soldiers. They called it Die Fabrik des Himmels, the factory of heaven. No matter how many planes they shot down, more appeared. No matter how many tanks they destroyed, new ones rolled in from across the sea. It was as if the very earth had turned against them. But the truth was simpler. It wasn't heaven. It was Detroit. It was Pittsburgh. It was Cleveland, Chicago, and every small town that sent its sons to the foundries instead of the front. In those endless nights, when the sky was painted orange with the glow of furnaces, when the clang of steel echoed like distant drums, the workers knew, without medals, without glory, that they were the unseen soldiers of the war. Their battlefield was the assembly line. Their weapon was the hammer. And their victory, though silent, was certain. Because in every beam of steel that left the factory floor, in every plate of armor that wrapped a tank or ship, was a defiance that no tyrant could crush. It was the sound of freedom being forged, the sound that Hitler couldn't silence, the sound of the steel he could never copy. The winter of 1944 found Europe burning. From Normandy to the Ardennes, the sky was thick with the smoke of liberation. Every tank that rolled across the frozen soil, every thunderous shell that screamed from an artillery gun, bore the unmistakable fingerprint of American industry. The enemy's lines weren't being broken by sheer numbers alone. They were being crushed by the precision, endurance, and ingenuity of a nation that had turned its factories into fortresses. On the front, soldiers joked that their real generals were named Ford, Chrysler, and General Electric. Their rifles worked in the mud, their tanks didn't stall in the snow, and their planes kept flying long after others should have fallen from the sky. The steel inside their weapons was not just metal, it was faith forged solid. It carried the sweat of the men and women who built it, the quiet prayers of those who never left the homeland but fought just as fiercely behind the lines of industry. The German panzer divisions, once the terror of Europe, began to shatter under the weight of numbers and resilience. Their tanks were deadly, yes, beautiful machines of war, crafted with the precision of engineers who worshipped design. But they were fragile in spirit. They broke easily. A Tiber tank could destroy a Sherman with one shot, But when its engine froze or its tracks failed, there were no replacements waiting, no endless line of fresh armor coming over the horizon. The American answer was not perfection. It was persistence. For every tank that burned, 3 more arrived. The soldiers on the ground began to understand what Washington and the War Department already knew. The war was being won not just with bullets, but with logistics. It was steel and oil and rubber that paved the road to victory. Behind every rifleman stood 10 factory workers, each one a silent partner in the fight for freedom. The miracle wasn't the strength of a single machine, it was the unstoppable tide of them. In the skies, the miracle shone brightest. The B-17 Flying Fortress and the B-24 Liberator filled the heavens with a thunder no one had heard before. Waves of bombers, hundreds strong, darkened the sun as they roared toward occupied Europe. From the ground, they looked like moving constellations, glowing dots of aluminum and fire. The Luftwaffe tried to meet them, but their pilots were exhausted, their planes old, their fuel reserves vanishing. Germany's synthetic oil plants couldn't keep up, and the very skies they once ruled now belonged to America's industrial children. Each bomber carried thousands of parts, each rivet a story of American defiance. In Los Angeles, an 18-year-old welder named Mary Thompson had once written her initials inside the wing of a B-17 before it shipped overseas. Months later, a pilot would look down over the Rhine River and whisper thanks to the nameless workers who had built his guardian angel. That was the war's hidden poetry, an invisible bond between the home front and the battlefield. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the Allied generals marveled at the rhythm of supply. Eisenhower's headquarters received daily reports that read like miracles: 30,000 trucks a month, 50,000 tons of ammunition, endless fuel, endless food. The Red Ball Express, an army of drivers, most of them African American, raced through the night on newly forged steel tires, carrying the lifeblood of the war forward. When the German offensive struck in the Ardennes, it wasn't strategy that saved the Allies. It was steel and gasoline. America's gift to freedom rolled in by the mile. Hitler's scientists, desperate to counter the avalanche, turned to wonder weapons: the V-2 rockets, the jet engines, the monstrous Tiger II tanks. But each innovation was a dead end, a masterpiece without a future. They lacked the one thing America had in limitless supply: the ability to build. What good was a miracle weapon if you could only make a handful? For every German V-2 that soared, America built 1,000 planes. For every Panther tank that rumbled to the front, 5 Shermans were already waiting in the next convoy. The numbers told the story. The Reich's factories were running on fumes. Its railroads lay in ruins. Its workers were starving. Back home, the factories still thundered, working around the clock, oblivious to fatigue. By 1944, production had reached a level no historian could have predicted. America was turning out nearly 100,000 aircraft a year, more than all the Axis powers combined. Liberty ships were being launched faster than the ocean could name them. Steel mills poured so much molten metal that it glowed across the horizon like dawn, even at midnight. And yet, the miracle was not just in the quantity. It was in the quiet dignity of those who made it possible. The women who learned to weld better than any man before them. The immigrants who spoke little English but worked with perfect precision. The black laborers who toiled in segregated yards, building the same ships that would one day bring freedom to the world. They did not ask for thanks. Their names rarely appeared in the newspapers, but they were the pulse that kept the heart of America beating through the darkness. In December 1944, when the Battle of the Bulge raged through the frozen forests, it was American production that broke the siege. Thousands of trucks, millions of shells, and endless replacement armor arrived faster than the Germans believed possible. The Wehrmacht couldn't comprehend it. To them, it was as though the Americans were summoning weapons from thin air. But there was no magic, only machinery, manpower, and will. By early 1945, the tide was irreversible. The Reich's cities were smoldering ruins. Hitler's armies retreated on every front. The German people, once promised a 1,000-year empire, now fought for bread. Across the Atlantic, the furnaces still burned, though the workers knew the end was near. They worked not for vengeance, but for closure. They worked so that their sons could come home alive. When the first American forces crossed the Rhine in March, they did so on pontoon bridges built from Pittsburgh steel. The same alloy that had once built skyscrapers and trains now carried entire divisions toward Berlin. Every bolt, every beam was a silent declaration that democracy could build faster than tyranny could destroy. The world's mightiest war machine had not been forged by conquest, but by cooperation, by unity, by millions of ordinary people who refused to surrender their faith in each other. The miracle of steel had become the miracle of freedom. And far behind the front lines, in a small factory town outside Detroit, a whistle blew at dawn. The night shift was over. The war wasn't finished yet, but the workers didn't rest. They stayed. They kept building. Because somewhere across the sea, another young soldier might need one more bullet, one more tank, one more ounce of hope made real. That was America's secret. That was the steel Hitler could never copy.